So I've had a few let's not meet encounters, and several creepy encounters from where I live, the people I encounter on a daily basis and the like. This happened a few years ago, when I was just 13. I was somewhat popular in school at the time, and I had four very, very close friends. Rose, Lynn, Noah, and Zach were the main ones. We went on many adventures around that time. Camping, road trips, the beach. Noah's family was pretty wealthy, and all of our families were pretty lenient with rules. One day, the summer before 8th grade, we went on a camping trip with Lynn's older sister Margot and Zach's older brother Todd. There were 7 of us in total. Lynn, Zach, and I were 13. Noah and Rose were 14. And Margot and Todd were 17. We decided to go camping in a nearby forest, around 20 miles from Noah's house. It was pretty much in the middle of nowhere. Noah's house and his neighborhood were the closest homes to us, and there were no signals for phones or any electronics. We get to the spot easily and without problems, and we begin to make camp, the girls in one tent and the boys in the other. Maybe it was a pretty bad idea to have 7 teens, ages 13 to 17, with no phone in the woods, but our parents were lenient, like I said, and confident that we would be fine, since the woods were not known for anything bad or dangerous. So we set up the tents, go swimming in a nearby lake, and come back and make dinner over fire, which was about 20 feet away from the tents, which were about 4 feet away from each other. We have s'mores and do all those stupid camping things before Lynn and Margot announce that they're going to bed. That left Todd, Rose, Zach, Noah, and I as we joked around. We told scary stories and just overall had a pretty good time. Then Margot walks up annoyed and tells us that whoever it is messing with the side of the tent had better stop it. Keep in mind that nobody had left the group, and the tents were far enough away to not bother anyone with our talking. She explains that someone keeps touching the side of the tent, running something into it, and we dismiss her. Todd states that it's probably just a swinging tree branch, and Rose and I decide to go to sleep as well. We head back to the tent. Lynn is already asleep, and as we settle in, it's me closest to the opening. Margot is next to Lynn, who is on the opposite side of the tent, and Rose is in between us. I managed to fall asleep pretty easily, within 5 minutes, until I woke up suddenly for what seemed like no reason. I checked my phone. I still brought it in a portable charger just to take pictures, and it was literally in the middle of the night at 2:15. I looked around, my eyes getting used to the darkness, trying to figure out why I had woken up. A tapping sound on the tent was the first thing that I noticed, and a soft giggling. It sounded somewhat deep, like a male voice, but I couldn't quite be sure. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only a minute or two, the tapping and giggling suddenly stopped. I was convinced that it was my imagination, or maybe one of the boys trying to play a trick on us. Maybe even a tree branch like Todd had suggested earlier. Telling myself that it was just a tree branch and lack of sleep, I fell back asleep until Rose woke me up around dawn. Everyone was awake and we decided to take a little hike. We decided to go in 2 groups because we planned on spending the night again and we didn't want anyone messing with our stuff. Even though these woods weren't popular with camping, we just didn't want to risk it. Margot, Lynn, Rose, and I left to go hiking for a couple of hours, while the boys opted to stay behind and fish, swim, and cook food. We hiked for about 2 hours, but we came back to find the boys not at the campsite. Annoyed, Margot went down to the lake with Lynn to find them. Rose and I made our way back to the tents, and I'll be honest and say that I screamed and almost wet my pants. The tents were slashed apart. I inspected it closer after regaining composure, because I was usually the more collected one of the 2 of us. It seemed to be made with a small knife, as the cuts themselves were small. Our tents were made of material that was pretty hard to cut into, and it seemed like the person had a pocket knife, I guessed. The boys, Margot and Lynn, came running to our screams, and were obviously very startled. We decided to pack up and head home early, because for one, the tents were ripped too much to use again comfortably, and two, Rose, Lynn, and I were very creeped out. Even more so when Todd announced that his tires had been slashed. We were all freaking out, obviously. There was no cell phone service, Todd's tires were slashed, and there was no way any of us wanted to stay any longer. Luckily, Todd reported that Margot's tires looked fine, and she stated that she would take Noah and Lynn, drop them off to call 911 and their parents, and come right back for us. She drove a car, and there wasn't enough room for more than 3 people, as the back was filled up with the camping stuff. Zach, Todd, Rose, and I were left at the campgrounds, and we decided to begin a hike back towards the main road so she wouldn't have to drive so far. Also, Rose and I refused to stay anywhere near the camp area. My phone died. The last time I had looked at it, it was 1 in the afternoon. Zach and Rose both had working phones, and constantly updated us on how far we had been walking. I began to hear branches snapping from behind us, closer to the trees than we walked, and I got more and more paranoid as time went on. I told Todd, and he seemed to get more wary of our surroundings, constantly looking over his shoulder. We had been walking for about 30 minutes. Margot was probably at Noah's house, or almost there, when Todd suddenly screamed, "Run!" Naturally, I looked behind my shoulder before I began running. 3 hooded figures were running towards us. 2 had knives, and they all looked around 6'3" or taller. Todd was 6'1", but I doubted he could defend all of us against them. Even though it was broad daylight, I couldn't make out any facial features. They all appeared over or around 200 pounds, the shortest one being probably 6'2", but they all wore hoods and had masks on, like ski masks. It sounds kind of fake, and I don't care if you don't believe me, but I was scared shitless that day. We began running, and the 3 guys eventually gave up, or decided we weren't worth terrorizing, because we suddenly lost them. We made it to the main road where we waited, walking quickly, constantly looking over our shoulders in fear until Margot arrived. We told the police everything, and they searched the woods nearby. They never found any evidence we had been there, or that the guys were there, or that anything had happened besides pictures of the lake around the area and the shredded tents. I didn't know what would have happened if they had caught us. I'm fairly tall. I was around 5'10" during this time, only about 125 pounds. Rose was around 5'1" and 100 pounds, and Zach was barely 5'9" at the time. I'm so thankful that I told Todd about them. I have no doubt they would have been able to catch us if he hadn't been looking over his shoulder constantly. And I'm also thankful we all got physical activity regularly, so we were fast enough to outrun them, and they eventually gave up. Right after I graduated high school, I went to our community college where my best friend at the time and her boyfriend also attended, along with a lot of their friends who I became acquainted with as well. Fast forward to Halloween of 2010. We took my best friend's little sister and brother out trick-or-treating, where her boyfriend ended up joining us. We were towards the end of the route, when one of their friends from the college ended up joining us. I didn't think anything about it at the time, other than he gave me some weird vibes, which should have been my first clue. After we were done trick-or-treating, we brought the kids home to go to bed, but my friends wanted to go do something to keep the night going. You know, since it's Halloween in a college town. That's an excuse to party just like any other day. They decided on going downtown, but I declined since I wasn't feeling well. It was true, but I was also the only one with a car and didn't want to be the chauffeur, and I went home. A few hours later, I was in bed reading a book. I still lived with my mom and brother, and my phone lit up from a number I didn't recognize. It was the friend that had joined us while trick-or-treating. He explained that he got my number from my best friend's boyfriend, and he was concerned that I didn't feel well, and insisted on bringing me up soup to help me feel better. Some sort of red flag went off in my head, and I didn't want this man to know where I lived, so I said no and that my mom was taking care of it. He got a little pushy, but eventually backed down and proceeded to send me many texts about how much fun he had when we were out. I later found out he had bailed going downtown too because he only wanted to go with me. He then added me to Facebook, went through all of my pictures and liked them. Being the naive 18-year-old I was, I thought maybe he was just being overly friendly and was just a little weird, so I didn't avoid him or anything at school since we hung out with the same people. One day when we didn't have school, he texted me asking if I wanted to go out for lunch. I should have said no, but I accepted, thinking I was getting a free meal out of the deal since he insisted on paying and it would be a quick visit. We met at the restaurant and sat down and talked and ate. It was super awkward, and then I stupidly mentioned that I wanted to go to the mall and get some stuff. He insisted on driving me there, and that his mom can move to the back seat. Wait, what? Apparently, he drove his mom's minivan, brought her with him, and left her in the car while we went on our date. I kept saying that she should come in and join us, and he got really weird about it, and said she was napping and didn't mind waiting. At that point, I started getting very uncomfortable. Luckily, we were done with our food, and I said I needed to leave, thanked him for the food, and got up to go. He kept saying he'll meet me at the mall, and I was put in what I felt like was a weird position. I'm not an assertive person by any means, so I reluctantly said okay. We'd meet at a large store connected to the mall, and I mentioned how I was there to look for a new scarf and started browsing. He picked out the most expensive one he could find and bought it for me, basically almost threatened me not to return it. It was then I wanted to be left alone, so I said thank you and that I'd be going home now. He insisted on walking me out to my car. We were parked on opposite ends of the mall, and his mom was still left in the van. I kept telling him that I was okay, that I was fine. He was a big guy, and even simple walking caused him to break out in a sweat, but he wouldn't take no for an answer, so away we went. We passed by another and took a quick look inside. There were a pair of boots that I very quickly, in passing, mentioned were cute, but I didn't know if I'd wear them. He bought them for me immediately, and did the same somewhat threat not to return them because they were gifts, and you don't return gifts. At that point I got a little firmer, and told him that I wanted to be alone, so please don't walk me out to my car. He accepted this and went on his merry way, clearly happy that he had made those purchases to show me how much he liked me. I go out to my car and wait for about 20 minutes. I knew what his van looked like at this point, and kept my eye out for it in case he was going to follow me home, but I didn't see anything. I actually ended up going back to the mall and returned both of the gifts. In reality, I didn't want either of them, and I was way too uncomfortable accepting those gifts from a strange person. I don't like owing people, and I had a feeling he was going to use that as some sort of leverage to get something from me. I took the long way home to make sure I wasn't being followed, and told my mom about what had happened. She was concerned and thought it was strange as well, since he and I didn't know each other at all, and it seemed like a weird act of desperation. I got a text from him a few hours later, saying he hoped that I had liked his gifts. I responded saying that I returned them because I wasn't comfortable with it, and he lost it. My phone kept lighting up with tons of texts. This was before it was easy to block someone, and I didn't know how to. The old flip phone. And he was livid that I had done such a disrespectful thing. I should be thankful that he got those things for me. I got angry and told him that I didn't ask him for any gifts. He basically threatened me to keep them anyway, and he didn't take no for an answer when I told him to stop. so essentially he was the one who disrespected me. He backed down quite a bit then. I told him to stop texting me and leave me alone. I got a few more, but eventually he stopped. It was weird at school because I kind of avoided being around my friends when I knew he was there. I still hung out with some of them alone like my best friend, but when I knew a friend gathering was going on, I wouldn't go. They understood. Now this is where I got stupid. I'm a very compassionate person, and 9 times out of 10, I feel horrible for when I was mean to someone, even in this instance. I ended up texting the creeper one night, apologizing for how rude I had been to him, and he said he understood where I was coming from. We had a normal conversation for a bit, until I fell asleep around 11 p.m. I know this because I woke up at 2 a.m., looked at my phone, and saw the last text I sent him was a little before 11, stating I was tired. After I had fallen asleep, he kept sending me texts after seeing I didn't respond. We're talking on the verge of 30 to 40 texts here. Called me from his cell phone about 10 times, called me from another number 15 times because he thought I was ignoring him, and then sent one last threatening message. If you don't respond within half an hour, I'm calling the police. I happened to wake up at 2 a.m., which was an hour after he sent that text, and flipped the fuck out, texting him that I fell asleep and that he better not have called the police. You want to know why he called the police? Because he interpreted me saying I was tired as I was tired of living. He thought I'd kill myself. Never mind that, it was basically bedtime when he and I were talking. I ran into my mom's room, told her what happened, and then she goes, "For crying out loud, they have better things to do with their time. They aren't coming to check on you." I go back into my room, which looked out into our driveway, look out the window and see a cop car parked on the street, and 2 flashlights walking up the drive. They knock on the door and I open it. I'm pretty sure the look on my face told them anything. "You Sally?" "Yep." "You know why we're here?" "Yep." "So what happened?" "I fell asleep." The police understood and actually called the creep back and told him to leave me the fuck alone, just as I was texting him the same. He had the gall to ask for my address again. He had done this numerous times, to come over and apologize to me and say that he loved me. I told him that he didn't even know me and had absolutely no reason to be in love with me. His reasoning was that's how he worked. He fell in love at first sight, and then decided that if it was the right person or not. The dude was loony. This put a really big strain on my friendships at college. His version of the story was much more twisted, and painted me as the bad guy, so I ended up making a lot of enemies, even with my best friend since he labeled me as a whore. There was another guy interested in me as well among those friends, but he was much less assertive and I didn't give him the time of day. Everyone believed him, even though at the time I was still a virgin. I had to drop out of school because that circle of friends was so big, and whenever the creep saw me he would get irrationally angry, and his friends had to physically hold him back, which was a lot of people because he was massive. I since cut contact with all of them, and ended up going to a different school that I loved so much more. I'm in a much better place without all of them in my life. Back in 2011, I was within a circle of friends that had made it a tradition to go camping in a certain spot every May long weekend. The spot we chose was in a beautiful area right on the edge of a large lake, and was located on government land. The lake itself had a dam on it, so during May long the water levels were always low, if not completely empty, making it possible to walk across it. People were allowed to camp there, as long as they weren't causing trouble or making a mess, and it was generally a good time for everyone. The spots themselves were spaced far enough apart that you had your own privacy, but not far enough so that you couldn't meet other people. In this particular year, our spot was in the middle of a small hill, with one campsite below us and one above us. The first night of our trip happened without incident. During the second day, The people staying at the site below us had moved in. We didn't think much of it, and continued drinking throughout the day and into the night. At about midnight, though, the people at the campsite below us were getting really out of control. They were yelling and screaming, and their music had gotten even louder, so our friend Ben went to ask them to turn it down. He was promptly punched in the face, and came back to inform us that he was 90% sure they were on drugs. After that, the vibe wasn't as relaxed, and we were all somewhat on edge. I was feeling really tired, so I just decided to go to bed. Some of my friends were still awake, including Ben and one couple, Lily and Derek. They were visiting another campsite we had made friends with that day. I could hear the campsite below was still blasting their music and partying really hard, but I just tried to ignore it and go to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I was jolted awake. Parts of this are somewhat a blur. All I know was that I sat straight up as soon as I heard the screaming and yelling coming from outside my tent. I quickly ran outside to find the campsite in chaos. One of my friends was clutching their chest. People were running around and screaming to call 911. I was quickly informed of what had happened. Apparently, not long after I had gone to bed, the people camping at the site below us decided they weren't finished talking to Ben, and on their way up they had encountered the Lily and Derek walking back. Now Derek and Ben are around the same height, and have the same color hair, so they assumed Derek was Ben, and bottled him and Lily over the head with a full glass bottle. I don't know if it was the same guys that showed up at our campsite, but I was told that everyone else was sitting around the fire when 2 or 3 huge guys appeared from the darkness and walked over to them. One of them had a paring knife, and the other had a butcher's knife in their hands. Ben saw the knives and had gotten up to talk to them, and had barely spoken a word when the guy with the paring knife stabbed him once in the chest. At the same time, some people from the campsite above had seen the guys coming and came down to help. One of the guys, Tim, was coming down the hill when the guy with the butcher's knife ran up to him and stabbed him in the stomach. From there, sheer panic ensued. People called 911, but the ambulance was around half an hour away. This is where I came out of the tent. Tim's wound was bleeding profusely, and he was losing blood way too quickly. His friends ended up putting him in the back of his car and speeding off to meet the ambulance halfway. Ben was also bleeding, but his wound wasn't as deep as Tim's, and we were able to keep him calm until an ambulance arrived. The guys with the knives ran off into the darkness, back down to their campsite, and took off in their Land Rover. My boyfriend at the time and I had gotten into his car and drove to the entrance to try and flag down the policemen on their way to the scene. Once they arrived, we were informed to stay inside the car, as they had released a canine search unit to hunt down the people who had stabbed our friends. By the end of the night, they had arrested the men. They had tried to flee by driving their vehicle across the lake bed, where they got stuck in a muddy section of the lake. They were on a concoction of several drugs, as suspected. Luckily, both Tim and Ben survived, although Ben had lost a lot of blood and took a few weeks to recover from his wounds. Derek and Lily had huge goose eggs, and possibly one of them had a concussion, but I can't recall. It was definitely the scariest thing I've ever experienced, and a few of us had to testify against them in court. I've attached an online article about it, if you're interested at all in reading it.